All right, audio rolling, camera rolling. All right, Tim, action.
Hello, my name's Tim Malone, and I'm a retired American history teacher. And I've been putting my lectures up on YouTube, a YouTube channel, Tim Malone History Lectures. And this lecture today is going to be on World War I. Now, if you're watching my lectures in sequence, the previous two were on Wilson, Woodrow Wilson, and Wilsonianism, the doctrine of Wilson in foreign affairs, which still, to this day, dominates American foreign policy, Wilsonianism. I suggest that you look at those two lectures because this is like the third installment on what we might call Woodrow Wilson, Wilsonianism, and World War I. As I explained in those lectures, in American history, it's hard to talk about Woodrow Wilson, who's usually considered one of our best presidents, not in my opinion, as you'll find out if you watch the previous lectures. Woodrow Wilson, Wilsonianism, and World War I, they all get mixed together. And so, I encourage you to watch the Wilsonianism lectures before this one. But this one's on the event, World War I. In my opinion, and not just my opinion, in the opinion of a lot of historians, World War I is one of the most profound, one of the most important events in world history. In all of world history, World War I is a monster event. It caused, and now today is April 8th, 2025. So in August, it'll be 111 years since the start of World War I in 1914. And we're still in the backwash of that event. It was an epoch-changing event. Again, I think you have to go back all the way to the discovery of America by Christopher Columbus in 1492 to get an event that's as important in world history as World War I. Most Americans don't look at things like that way. But I'm a World War I guy. And it's a very strange event, not just profound, and epoch-changing. And the event that most caused the world we live in today, because of course World War I caused World War II. If you think about it, World War I caused Hiroshima and Nagasaki. World War I caused the Great Depression. World War I caused the Cold War. World War I caused the war in Ukraine today. You can make all those inferences from this 4-year monster event. Now, I have kind of a pet name for World War I. I call it the Stupid War. Because any event in history, when we talked about this back in one of the first lectures of this series about history itself, basically, commonsensically, any event in history can be broken down into the causes of the event itself, and then the consequences. Causes, the event, consequences of the event. World War I, the causes of World War I are stupid. And I don't know whether I should go into this. There was a secret alliance system before the war. And Serbia, a nation in the Balkan Peninsula, and the Austro-Hungarian Empire, Serbia had been part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire until just 20 years or so before the war. It was kind of a newly independent country, and there was trouble, as you might imagine, between the Austro-Hungarian Empire and recently liberated, from the Serbs' point of view, liberated Serbia. And the Archduke, the successor to the emperor's throne in Austria, visited Bosnia, which was bordered Serbia but was still part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and he was assassinated by a Bosnian nationalist, a teenager, a 19-year-old. And that was just because the Archduke's driver got lost and got in a traffic jam, and here's this kid with a revolver in his pocket, and he's like, well, look at this right in front of me. Kind of stupid. And then Austria took a front and sent demands to Serbia. The Austrians wanted the Serbs to consent to having Austrian police go into Serbia to look for the plot. There really was no plot. Stupid. The Serbians, of course, were like, well, we're not letting your police into our country to arrest people. So tensions between Serbia and the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and Austria-Hungary mobilized its army. Now all the powers, France, Germany, Austria, Russia, had reserve armies built up. So Austria called up their reserves as a threat to Serbia. The Russians, huge Russian Empire, considered themselves protectors of the Serbs. I don't even know why. They're not exactly the same nationality, Russians and Serbs. So when Austria-Hungary mobilized, Russia said to Austria-Hungary, demobilize or we're going to mobilize. Now the Russians and the French had a secret alliance against Germany. And Austria had a secret alliance with Germany. So when Russia said to Austria-Hungarian, demobilize or else, then Russia started mobilizing its reserves. That got Germany nervous because Germany had a war plan where if war broke out, they were going to attack France, Russia's secret ally. The Germans knew that. Wasn't that big a secret. To attack France first and then Russia. So Russia threatens Austria. Austria goes to Germany. Germany says to Russia, demobilize or else. The Russians say no, so the Germans attack France. Stupid. The French are like, what? Because of the Schlieffen plan to attack France first and then Russia, Schlieffen was dead. So a dead guy, his plan, triggers World War I. Stupid. England then, the Schlieffen plan was for Germany to invade France through Belgium. The English had a treaty with Belgium, so they declare war on Germany, and you get France, Germany, Russia against Austria-Hungary and Germany, and then the Ottoman Empire. To this day, historians argue about what the hell? And then the result is this terrible, murderous stalemate, this trench warfare stuff. And again, sort of the explanation for that is what we call technological lag, which is one of the points that I like to make about World War I, is that the leaders of the countries involved, it had been 100 years since the Napoleonic Wars. The last major war between major powers was 100 years. And the technology of war had changed drastically in that 100 years. But the leaders, the political and military leaders of the countries they still thought they were fighting Napoleon. And thus you get this stupid trench warfare. So the causes of the war are stupid, and there's still books being written about what caused World War I. Stupidity. Then we have, so the causes are stupid, then we have the war itself, trench warfare, this murderous stalemate. I mean, even to this day, when movies are made about World War I, it's dark and grim and pessimistic. I mean, the trench warfare was just almost unimaginable. the war was stupid. And no, the generals and the politicians who led these countries couldn't figure out that having men charge the machine guns wasn't going to work. Well, it'll work this time, men. Let's charge the machine guns again. There were rebellions, there were mutinies in almost all the major armies at some point during the war because, of course, the soldiers were like, come on, men, let's charge the machine guns again. And every so often the men would go, no. And I mean, all British, French, Russian, German, Austrian, all the major powers' armies shot tens of thousands of their own soldiers for cowardice because they said, what the hell, General? What are you, stupid? Yes. And then, of course, we talked in the previous lectures about Wilson and Wilsonianism. We talked about the consequences of the war. Of course, the consequences of World War I was World War II and the genocide and the brutality, the war crimes of World War II. In fact, A.J.P. Taylor, the famous British historian, says they should be considered one war with a 20-year truce, effort to solve the German problem in Europe. The Treaty of Versailles, stupid. The treaty caused another war. And there were people at the time who knew that. It wasn't like, whoa, World War I didn't solve anything. Now we're going to have a bigger, nastier, genocidal war because the First World War, the peace treaty, was so stupid. There were people at the time who said, hey, this peace treaty is stupid. It's going to cause another war. Oh, no, that's okay. You know, we'll impose it on Germany. Stupid. The causes were stupid, the war was fought stupidly, and the peace was stupid. But of huge consequence. The event, World War I, is of huge consequence in world history. World War I. A true turning point in world history. A watershed in world history. Indeed, as I said earlier, it is perhaps the turning point in all of modern history. World War I. Now, here I'm going to show you a chart that I put up in my first lecture in this series about history itself. It's called Thinking Like a Historian. And of course, the main, they have 5 things that historians do, thinking like a historian. And the very first one, of course, is cause and effect, not surprisingly. Cause and effect. And the fact of the matter is that, as I just said, World War I serves as a good event to examine as a historian, thinking like a historian, when you want to think about historical cause and effect, in 2 senses. One, World War I, as I just said, the causes are blurry. The causes are, it doesn't make sense that the assassination of the Archduke Ferdinand should lead to this profound, ugly, dark historical event. In fact, I have here an article by William Pfaff, World War I, Its Lessons for the 21st Century. This was written in November 10th, 1998. This is old. That was the 80th anniversary of the start of World War I. Pfaff, he's deceased now. He was a columnist for years. Lived in Paris mostly. He wrote about international affairs. He wrote like a historian. That's why I like him. But Pfaff says about World War I. The most important fact about World War I is that it was unexpected, unpredicted, and one can even say uncaused. The causes of the war are so seemingly inconsequential that Pfaff says the World War I was uncaused. Unexpected, unpredicted, and uncaused. Now, as a historian, I should be like, what? Come on, everything's caused. What do you mean uncaused? No, uncaused. An event that changes everything can be uncaused. Here are some other things that Pfaff says, writing in 1998. November 11th is the 80th anniversary of the end of World War I, the most important event of the 20th century, making that century what it has been and the next century what it will be, since the effects of the titanic events of 1914 to 1918 have yet to be finished. Now that's 26 years ago? I'm telling you that the titanic events of World War I, the consequences are still playing out to this day. The war invented totalitarianism. Whoa. Totalitarianism. World War I invented it. Its model of societies totally disciplined by the government to vast struggles was adopted by the Soviet Union in what we will come to call communism and North Korea. Today, still. The losses and humiliation of Germany brought Hitler to power. World War I invented communism and fascism. And the fascism, we're battling a form of fascism to this day around the world. Fascism seems to be revivified here in the last 10 years, 15 years. Was invented by World War I. The war produced World War II, and that produced the end of European world predominance and colonialism. The United States was launched on the course that has brought it to be the sole superpower today. The most important fact about World War I is that it was, here it is again, unexpected, unpredicted, and even say uncaused. And again, after that, I put uncaused in capital letters with an exclamation point because I'm a historian. What do you mean, uncaused? It kind of boggles the mind that something like that can happen. When I talk to my classes about nuclear war, the nuclear bomb, the nuclear balance of terror, which we're still in, we don't think much about nuclear weapons. I'll talk about nuclear weapons in an upcoming lecture. The balance of terror, uncaused. See, when you know about World War I, and you think about thousands of nuclear weapons around the world, you get nervous. Uncaused. I always thought that's probably how the nuclear war is going to start. Something stupid. Bluff. Threat. Bluff. Threat. And then it all slides out of control. And you get a monster event. No proportionate cause existed in Europe for war, and certainly not the kind of war which occurred. This is Pfaff. There was no proximate cause that you could scale to the event that occurred as a result. That can happen? You can stumble in to a titanic event? No one in 1900 could have written a plausible scenario for the events which actually occurred. What really happened in 1914 and what followed during the rest of the 20th century was literally unimaginable, and hence it was not imagined. Wow. That's profound. That is the lesson. You can make forecasts, write scenarios, project trends, but the future in its real dimensions is unimaginable. Boy, it can get you depressed thinking like that. You can stumble into cataclysmic events uncaused. That's Pfaff's take on World War I. Another point about World War I. It was the first major industrial war. Mass warfare. The first total war. We talked about that a little bit earlier. Totalitarianism. A society totally mobilized. Now, the way most historians think about it, and I think about it this way too, is that before World War I, total war was impossible. Now, I don't know about that. You think back to like the Peloponnesian Wars in Greece in the 5th century BC, when Athens and Sparta went at each other. I think those city-states were pretty much totally mobilized for war. But the idea is that the Industrial Revolution, starting in the late 1700s in England and spreading quickly to Western Europe and then to the United States. And again, there's a lecture in my series about the rapid industrialization of the United States, this thing called industrialization, modernization, development, a revolution. The Industrial Revolution, of course, changed the politics and the political structure of nations that went through it. Unimaginable productive power in the nations that were industrialized. And again, the Napoleonic Wars, ending in 1815, were the last major war between major powers in Europe before World War I. There was 100 years between the Napoleonic Wars and World War I. And during that time, the Industrial Revolution happened. Now, it started before, but that's when it profoundly happened. So the societies that went to war in 1914 were very different than anything that a large continental war could be foreseen as consisting of. And as I said earlier in this lecture, the politicians and the generals had not adapted to the technological changes. It's something that I call technological lag, where technology, and I'm a bit of a technologist, what drives history? What drives history the most? Technological development. So the idea is, what World War I shows, is that technology can get ahead of culture, technology can get ahead of politics. Your leaders don't understand the change that has taken place. And boy, it's very pertinent to today, 2025. The internet, the digitization of everything, artificial intelligence. Do our leaders understand the technological playing field anymore? And that can cause catastrophe. Technology runs ahead of the human ability to comprehend what it's doing. Technological lag. I don't know. So in other words, it's been 80 years since World War II. Now there's been plenty of smaller conflicts. I mean, there's a war in Ukraine right now, and I've asked the question, during the 3 years of the Ukrainian war, what kind of war is the Ukrainian war? Because it doesn't look like World War II, it doesn't look like Vietnam, it doesn't look like anything. What is it? I should do a lecture, in fact I will, on war in history, the development of war, because I think we might be suffering from technological lag right now as regards conflict, war. What kind of war is it? What's changed? Are we up to speed on what AI and digitization has wrought in terms of war-making capacity? Or are we going to be fighting the past war when we should be fighting the present war? I don't know. World War I is the classic example of technological lag, one of the classic examples. And again, you get this, the idea is that only an industrialized nation can engage in total war. Now, there's books written about total war. Sherman's March to the Sea and the Civil War. Oh, there's the beginning of total war. There's a book by an ex-NATO commander some years ago. The Napoleonic Wars were total wars. Totalitarianism, total war. I mean, the society is totally mobilized for war. Every able-bodied man in, every factory, every shop, media, everything's mobilized for war. Total war. World War I. Now, I'm a World War I guy. The first total war was World War I. The classic total war is World War II. Now, I mean, are either Ukraine or Russia today waging total war? I don't think so. Total war, you can tell by looking at the streets of the major cities. They're deserted. Everybody's, all able-bodied men, every shop, every factory. No, you see images of downtown Kyiv and downtown Moscow in this war, and rush hour, people going about their business. I'm going to have to think about this. But at any rate, the concept of totalitarianism comes out of World War I. Because there's people, Hitler, the communists, wherever they crop up, like North Korea right now is a classic capital C communist country, a totalitarian regime, because the leadership of North Korea runs their country as if they're at war all the time. The totalitarianism, you run your country as if it's at total war all the time. Because there are some people who looked at what, and in World War I, you had England, France, and Germany. I guess Austria-Hungary, Russia to a certain extent, totally mobilized for the first time. Because again, the idea is that you can't wage total war unless you're an advanced industrialized country. Less developed countries can't engage in total war. They don't have the capacity. It takes a modern, industrialized, developed government to totally mobilize a society. Now, the United States was only in the war for 19 months, World War I. We attempted total mobilization, but I don't know if we got there. Now, World War II, that's America totally mobilized for war. If you want to think about America in total war. Totalitarianism. As I said, you know, World War I is instructive as to the question of causation in history. First, the causes of World War I are murky, but that World War I caused World War II is clear. What caused World War II? World War I. Boom, done. World War I. Three-word answer to what caused World War II? World War I. What caused World War I? There's still books being written. What? Because historians can't seem to think that an event of that magnitude could be, as Pfaff says, in effect uncaused. World War I, it was the bad war, as opposed to World War II, the good war. And again, in my lectures about Wilson and Wilsonianism, I said this, but let me repeat it. World War I was never popular with the American people. Woodrow Wilson manipulated an unwilling nation into an unnecessary war. An American entry into World War I was decisive in the outcome and the failure of the peace and the Holocaust and Hiroshima, World War II. Another point I'd like to make about World War I, and I've made this point before in these lectures, World War I's hard to see by American people because we automatically look past World War I through World War II, which was popular. Well, the Japanese attacked us. Now again, I'm going to present some from a book. By Jack J. Roth. He wrote a book called The First World War as a Turning Point. Again, if we looked at the thinking like a historian, cause and effect, and then another thing historians do is they look for turning points or watersheds. And again, some of this is repetitious. World War I introduced the phenomenon of total war, introduced new war-making functions to the government, the birth of the modern state, the rise of the United States and the Soviet Union to a bipolar world dominated the Cold War. Despite the fact that America refused, it doffed its great power status after World War I, went home back into capital I isolation, didn't join the League of Nations. Even when Hitler was rampaging in Europe in 1939, 1940, had England on the ropes, the United States still didn't want to get involved. And Hitler's Germany was far more a threat to the United States than World War I Germany ever was. And of course, the Soviet Union was isolated after World War I. The powers, Britain, France, United States, thought that if they ignored the new regime, Lenin, in Russia, that it would collapse of its own weight, that it would go away. So the peace after World War I was constructed in Europe without Russia, which, if you look at a map, it's like, well, that ain't going to work. And it didn't. But the capitalist nations were vehemently opposed to this new communist regime and ignored it, isolated it, didn't involve it in the post-World War I peace settlement. Didn't work. 3, turning point, legacy of World War I, the weakening of European colonialism and imperialism. The world was divided up into huge empires before World War I. British, French, still Spanish, Portuguese, Belgians for Christ's sakes. And World War I weakened colonialism and imperialism. This is personified in Mahatma Gandhi, the leader of India, which was a British colony. Mahatma Gandhi, the leader of the Indian independence movement between the wars. India got its independence right after World War II. Gandhi was an Anglicized Indian living in South Africa, another British colony. And he witnessed these supposed advanced nations to be emulated, France, Britain, Belgium, precipitate this colossal, ugly trench warfare. And it was like, these are the people we're supposed to be like, we're supposed to emulate, we're a colony of these people. Gandhi was explicit about it, but it reverberated throughout these empires. World War I weakened European colonialism and imperialism. Also, World War I weakened laissez-faire capitalism. Capitalism was weakened. The stark wartime governmental economic management, total mobilization, we're back to that. Free markets, no, not during wartime. Total mobilization. The government runs everything. And again, there were people who said, yeah, all the time. That's anti-capitalistic. Totalitarianism is anti-capitalistic. It's managed economy. The government takes over everything. Not just during the war, all the time. That's totalitarianism. You run your government, you run your country as if it's at total war all the time. North Korea. The war strengthened pre-war intellectual and political currents of irrationalism because the war was stupid. World War I was irrational, and it strengthened nihilism, right? The idea that nothing matters, there's no moral structure, everything's dark, everything's death. Nihilism. The cult of violence was strengthened by World War I. Darkness. Pessimism. And finally, the war was a blow to democracy. These were more or less democratic nations. Even Germany, although British and American propaganda during World War I will paint the Germans as the worst people in the world. And again, let me say this, and again, this is a contentious statement on my part, but in 1914, before the war, in my opinion, in some ways, Germany was a more democratic country than England. It wasn't like it was a totalitarian beast waiting to pounce on everybody, Germany, in 1914 before the war. And it's almost like, you know, this sounds kind of pat, you know, but it's like when World War II comes around, the Germans were like, yeah, you depicted us as inhuman monsters in World War I, so this time we're going to become inhuman monsters. World War II, the Holocaust. We'll be what you want us to be, Germany said. What you painted us as, falsely, in World War I. And again, in the Wilsonian lectures, I had a poster during World War I in the United States. It has a sailor, and it says, he's keeping us safe for the world for democracy. Enlist and help him. You might as well put Wilson in there. Wilson is keeping the world safe for democracy. No. Nope. Woodrow Wilson made the world unsafe for democracy because World War I discredited the democratic states of Western Europe that ran these vast empires. Democracy wasn't made safe by World War I. It was damn near destroyed by World War I. Ironic, right? That's irony. That's irony for you right there.